one of many events, as Ross was saying, that we've organized over 11 days to commemorate and mark the end of World War I at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, on Sunday. But also to consider the seismic impact this war had globally, and also, most importantly, I think, its reverberations still today and its continued relevance. So this, as in all the programming, has really tried to position and make us remember that impact today and its relevance in so many ways in political discussions going on at the present. I also wanted to thank our many collaborators and partners across campus who've made all of this possible. But tonight I wanted to particularly thank Jennifer Scott, the Director and Chief Curator here at the wonderful Jane Addams Hull-House, and of course Ross Jordan and Cassie Ponton for their incredible hard work in putting tonight together. And I also wanted to express our gratitude to the John Levine International Development Fund, who have co-sponsored these programs, so we're thankful for that. Our discussion this evening is inspired by Jane Addams's bold and unapologetic activism and her vocal opposition to World War I in particular, which contributed to her receiving the Nobel Peace Prize later in 1931, the first American woman to do so. Addams was protesting against what came to be known as the war to end all wars. We know how unfortunate that overstatement proved to be, considering what followed. War and militarism has continued unabated, but so too has resistance, activism, and calls for peace and social justice by women all over the world. So tonight, by grounding our conversation in Jane Addams's actions during World War I, we hope to explore how contemporary activism by women connects to this past. What were the issues then, and what are they today? What has changed? I'm also interested in this idea of danger, these dangerous women. The danger that women like Jane Addams represent to the status quo, but also maybe more importantly, the danger that they face in that resistance. Often complex dangers affected by race, socioeconomic conditions, gender variance, and more. What was at stake for women who spoke out then and who speak out now? So our panelists, to start with, will each say a few words about their work, their interest in this topic, and some initial thoughts. But then I really want to open this up to be a conversation with questions from the panelists to each other, but also, of course, from the audience. And I believe you'll be getting some note cards to write questions. And also, of course, we can, if we have time, take questions from the floor. So let's get this started with Rima. And I'd like to ask Rima to really, again, take Jane Addams as our starting point and think about this moment in history during World War I.
There or here? Okay. Well, I'm a historian, so I feel a responsibility to sort of set a foundation. I don't know. I feel like I've been living with Jane Addams. I dream about her. I consider her handwriting my third language. There are 26 microfilm reels. Each of the reels there are 82 in the whole collection, but 26 just about correspondence. And they have, maybe 1,500 records in each of the 26 files, in each of the reels, representing hundreds and hundreds of letters. And they, however, thankfully, because people didn't have the kind of technology they have today, let us get into that period of time and understand what the sense of urgency was in a person like Jane Addams and her colleagues who felt they had to stop war. They had to stop it even as it was going on. They had to stop it as fast as they could and not let it continue a month or day more to kill more young people than necessary. You know, who was this woman? How did she come to be in a position to lead internationally a movement to try to stop World War I and later to outlaw war? I want to just give you a just brief detail of what I'm centering on, which is the International Committee of Women for Permanent Peace that came out of the Congress of Women, the International Congress of Women that met at The Hague between April 28th and May 1st, 1915. The war was already promulgated in Europe. So they came from both belligerent and neutral countries. Remember that the United States was a neutral country until 1917. 47 women came, including Jane Addams, from the United States. Women came primarily from Holland because they were a neutral country and they were there. And there was a big Dutch movement for suffrage and for peace already. And women came from 12 other countries too. And it was difficult. The months leading up to this were difficult. People were getting passports. People had to also get visas. People were stuck in boats waiting for safety to get to the Netherlands. It was difficult, and the letters that Addams writes, and Alice Hamilton, Dr. Alice Hamilton, who was her ally, who had been at Hull-House, who was the founder of occupational medicine and the first woman to be a professor of medicine at Harvard University. She was on the ship with Addams. Addams was 55. She was not in great health. Most of the women who were going to this conference were, and given that 75 was old at that time, I'm 75, I'm thinking, you know, but they had no antibiotics. This was fraught when you say danger. This was fraught with danger. They were private citizens, they had no portfolio. They redefined the iconic and domestic ideal of mothers for peace. Many of them were not mothers. Addams wasn't a mother. But she had written in 1907 a wonderfully important book that most people ignore called Newer Ideals of Peace. Everyone from William James to many other pragmatists and other people were very excited by what she had in mind, because she wanted to put flesh and bone on this idea, this hope of peace. You know, this wasn't something that, you know, oh, I don't want my child to fight, or, you know, we really have to be against war. Women should be against war. This was a consummate understanding of the relationship of social movements for liberation, for emancipation, with the stoppage of war. And the idea that a foundation for peace had to be in social justice. And I would say that when we think about Addams, and this is 1915, it is really the beginning of what we say today, no justice, no peace. Yeah. And that was very, why was she the leader? First of all, there was a really important suffrage movement internationally. Women were on the cusp all over the world of getting the vote. Women had the vote in Chicago. It wasn't complete, but they had the vote. In some other states in the United States, other countries were approaching the emancipation of women, the enfranchisement of women. But this meant that for a good 70 years, women had been meeting, they had been organizing, not because of biology, I would make the argument, but because of the historical moment in which they were living. They were situated in an emancipatory arc. And this is what carried them. And it brought them together. They knew each other. They began to see the commonalities and what else was wrong with the gender roles in society. And they began to envision organizations that would not just be about one thing, but would really be about human rights in a much larger way. Addams had been a leader in suffrage. She had been alongside striking trade unionists. She had been in the early civil rights movement as one of the founders of the NAACP. She was a social reformer involved with the moral crusades of the progressive era. She fought child labor. She fought for minimum wages. She fought for safety in the workplace and safety in the home, for pure milk. I mean, milk. Oh, all right, I'm going over. And so this was the thing. So when they came together, then what I want to make them, just to sum up, is that in being in this iconic situation where women without power, largely without the vote, stood maternalism on its head and made it clear that they would go to the elected officials all over the world, and they would try to begin a process of mediation and negotiation even before the war was over. And that was dangerous, but this is what they did. And out of that comes, finally, in 1919, the creation of a permanent organization called the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, of which Addams is the international president.
That's a lovely segue to Beth. So if you can speak to your involvement in that wonderful organization.
Yes, it really is a wonderful organization. And I came to WILPF circuitously. I probably, like most people, I grew up during the Vietnam War and during the Civil Rights Movement. And so for me, the peace movement and social justice movements were intricately related, and I didn't really distinguish them because I was 10, So, but I was interested, and so for some reason, I don't know how this happened, I started reading materials from Quakers. I was raised as a Catholic, and somehow or another started reading Quaker materials. Don't know how that happened, and don't even remember, but just started anyway. So when I got to college, I met a woman who knew a whole lot more about this stuff than I did, because I was from a very small town in Ohio, and we went to a school called Goucher, a women's college. And I chose the school because it sent me feminist literature. Well, there weren't very many feminists there, but I found a couple. The few that were there, we found each other. And we created together a chapter of WILPF on campus. But to be frank, at that point, we were really talking nuclear arms and sort of the demilitarization with nuclear arms. That was the major thrust of our work. And I don't think we got that far, but I got to know a lot of people in Baltimore and got involved in the Freeze campaign as things moved on. And then a whole lot of years passed. I graduated and did a whole lot of other things, and worked in Philadelphia for a time where Quakers are bigger and where WILPF's headquarters were. And then moved on to Rockford College when I finished graduate work. And Rockford College is Jane Addams' alma mater. So the first, during my interview, I asked, well, is there a WILPF branch of WILPF here at Rockford College? And people looked at me as if I was speaking Greek, you know, because people didn't know what it was. And I was so shocked because that was the reason I wanted to be there. Because for me, Jane Addams was already a hero, and why would you not know about this incredibly important organization? So I started Rockford College in the fall of 2002. Now, people might not remember this, but in March of 2003, we invaded Iraq, and so my WILPF group went into overdrive. We put together conferences and marches and all of the kind of standard work. But I also was working with a lot of students who wanted to also bring this home. And one of the things that I have always loved about WILPF is it doesn't do it perfectly. I'm not going to pretend that. But it has always understood the link, as Jane Addams did, between justice and peace. And so my students, I was asking them what they would like to do, and they said, the schools are so segregated here, Dr. McGowan. I mean, it's just crazy. And so we started to do some research. Well, we just happened to come in to the Rockford Public Schools just at the moment that they were actually about to pull apart a court order. The Rockford Public Schools in the late 80s, in the early 90s, were still doing such egregious kind of segregation and discrimination. The black students were still getting white students used textbooks in the late 80s and the early 90s. And so there was a court order to try to remedy some of these issues. And that court order created what was called limited choice. And so as actually unsuccessful in many ways as that was, it was a huge step forward in Rockford. So my students, with a little grant given to us by WILPF, actually started to interview people up and down the social networks of Rockford. They interviewed the mayor, they interviewed the superintendent of schools, they interviewed the people who brought the original suit, they interviewed students now about what they thought about what was coming. And then they put together a film. And it was not a great film, but it was amazing to watch them, because what they'd done all this research, and they did this amazing amount of learning, because they had everything at their fingertips when they started to interview people. And it was really tremendous. And if I had been better at film, if I had had any help, I was useless, really. We might have actually, what we had intended to do was to take that back out to the community and show it, and then have that be the next piece of the discussion, and sort of to move the conversation forward. But then my students graduated, and the film was there, and we didn't get nearly as far as I would have liked us to have gotten. But the learning and the understanding of race relations in this smallish Midwestern city, I think affected them dramatically. And for that, I was really grateful. Then I left Rockford College and have moved on to other things, but have started, again, a WILPF outside of the college branch, because it does seem to me that Rockford should have a WILPF branch. I mean, it's where Jane Addams went to school, so we have to work for her. And so, so now we have different kinds of projects that we're working on. And so I don't want to take too much more time, but I'll pass the torch along.
That's great.
Thank you.
I was following along. So good evening. It's good to see you all here. You know, for me as a CPS student, you know, I was in JROTC because I'll be honest, at first I was told it was a an alibi to get out of PE, right? So once you get in it, it's fun. I did a lot of things that a lot of my, student peers who were in PE didn't get to do. We traveled, we experienced a lot of the bells and whistles that JROTC entails. And so in my senior year, I enlisted in the Air Force and went into delayed enlistment, and then, went off to basic training. And, 20 years later, sometimes I can't, because my original plan was to leave for 4 years because, I needed some education, and, as an economic option, the military provided that for me. So I went into the Air Force, and this picture is really to just to really show that a little girl from the South Side, I experienced a myriad of experiences and assignments across the Department of Defense. And so rising to the level of being at the Defense Regional Center was like supposed to be a feather in a cap. But this assignment actually is one of the first that I would say started to wake me out of the sunken place. The more I was promoted, the closer I got to the truth, the more disillusioned I became. The more I realized and I knew the truth, and what I saw in the media didn't jive, right? And so it was really around this time that I started to really have that moral break, if you will, like, what am I doing? And so if we can move to the next. And I'll just give you a moment just to look over that while I'm speaking. But like I said, at that assignment, I really learned a lot of the things. My security clearance, got me more closer to the truth. And then I deployed on a joint assignment with Army, Marine, and Navy units. And so while in that situation, actually, can we go back? Did it actually go too far? And so while in that assignment, we deployed and did like we would call it a retrograde, when President Obama required for there to be a drawdown of Iraq and a buildup in Afghanistan. That is what our team went to do. And so, and what this decoration actually led to was a promotion for me, but I didn't realize what I was really participating in, right? Because I'll tell people, like, patriotism is a sunken place sometimes, where you don't understand everything about the mission because we're told this is what it's about, and don't look over here. Don't think about what I would say the deeper part of the story is. So this program that I worked on was really close to the Defense Department and higher headquarters in the Army. And so I knew what the mission set was supposed to be in Afghanistan. And so then when we go to the next picture, I realized, like, okay, these vehicles were bought for the battlefield. And then during the uprising after the killing of Michael Brown, and I saw them flash on the screen in Ferguson, it chipped me off a little bit. And I say that because this is a program that I directly impacted, and you can see I was actually good at it, to the tune of spending a lot of money. And I could not understand how Ferguson had them shooting rubber bullets and gas to people in the community that looked like me. And so I'll tell you, I don't know if it was the guilt that tripped in first, or if it was just, now how did this happen? So then I started doing research. Why did I do that? But the research took me to that we had bought too many. So while in Afghanistan, people were giving us commitments based on the terrain in Iraq. You can drive anywhere in the desert, but when you get to Afghanistan, there's mountains. So all of those vehicles that we bought from the Iraq plan could not drive in Afghanistan. We created a parking lot. So when the media found out about that, they sent pictures. It became a story. The Obama administration said, let's get them out of there. Let's send them to police departments for free. So that was about 2 years after I retired. After that, again, it was one of those, when I say the sunken place, like, I jolted out of it, right? The more I researched, the more I read, the more I understood, the more I started connecting everything that I had done across all of my assignments to, there was no room between the equipment that was bought for military warfare and what was being introduced in communities that looked like mine, that I had left home, right? And so it became very clear to me. I started taking leave. I started asking questions. I started aligning myself with social justice movements. Trayvon Martin was killed just before Michael Brown. And I started taking leave to go down to Sanford, Florida, and just connect with folks and understand, like, what does militarism look for you? Because for 20 years, I have been doing it in a patriotic, this is why we're keeping the boogeyman out of the US type of framework. What does it mean to you? That I started understanding that it actually started in high school. It started in JROTC. It started with the glorification of the military as a recruitment tool. It started off as, you know, a lot of the military, how we would go out and do community service, but what that did is it made us look cool to the young folks, you know, who a lot of times just really because of video gaming, they wanted like I will call it the excitement of Mortal Kombat, right? They wanted to know what it was like to shoot all of the things, right? And how I became a marksman and how, you know, all these battlefield ideologies of like why serving our country, and that it really just jolted me to say that this is not okay. And that I really didn't realize my position in JROTC. And then when I would come back home on leave, and my recruiter would be like, Natasha, we need you to come back and talk to some of the high schools. And I recruited people, right? And so when I came home, I wanted to do right by the things that I had actually, to share my experience, right? And to tell the story that I know that there are gonna be people that are gonna also take the economic route in serving their country. I know that there are people that are going to choose this option because there aren't many for some. And depending on your neighborhood and your zip code, there's a higher probability of that. Particularly when we see that Chicago Public Schools is the most militarized school system in the nation. And I say that because we're the third largest, but they have the most militarized cadets enrolled in their schools. So if we can go forward, there's a couple of snapshots and points that I wanted to make. When I came home, I started to research really just how deep Chicago was in terms of just being a militarized school system. I don't know if you all can see that, but just to kind of give like the bottom line up front, there are over 9,000 students enrolled in JROTC, both in high school and starting as young as middle school. Disproportionately, there are Black and Hispanic, Latinx community that is represented. Only 5% of cadets are white. And when we look at that, we were like, well, if it's such a good program, why isn't it more balanced than that? So a lot of the school districts that are in the majority white areas just don't want a JROTC program. Those are the schools that have art, language, and other opportunities to grow, right? And civics. When we look at CPS's impact, a lot of times the JROTC programs will tell you that majority of the funding comes from the Department of Defense. In actuality, CPS pays a huge chunk of to operate their JROTC program. In fiscal year 17, they were 13 million. FY18, they actually overspent and we're at 15, almost 16 million. And then projected this year, they're looking at spending 18 million on JROTC. When we look at those numbers, like what could be committed for that? We know that students in Inglewood are actually taking art online because they don't have it in the budget to pay for an art teacher. We know that they're also somehow taking PE online because the JROTC instructors are actually, remember, if they're in JROTC, they're not taking the PE. So we see that a lot of schools are actually losing their positions for the physical education teachers. And then when you kind of think about all of that, you think about the slippery slope that Rahm Emanuel actually introduced a initiative that the board quickly adopted. So the current high school juniors will have to have a plan before they get their diploma. Which was going to require them to either have college, gap year with college acceptance, a job offer, or military enlistment. And we know that for a lot of those folks that are overly represented in this JROTC model that are already primed are going to choose that option. Now, Veterans for Peace Chicago, we know that people are going to make those choices to join. We want to tell you about the things that we've experienced, right? We want to share the story and connect with parents so that you can better support your airman, soldier, or Marine when they leave and when they call home and they need some support, right? We don't want there to be this over-glorified lens of what military service is. It's actually war. It's actually violence. It's actually doing things that are against your morals. It is actually doing things that you probably never thought you were going to do and see. And sometimes you need some help to kind of unpack that and understand how to get around that and push through it. So we feel like veteran support should be something that is like really important. We just didn't have any idea that it should be as young as the high school level, but we see them being primed around the military model, and that's why we're wanting to get out and like share the message around what's important. So, Natasha, thank you.
Wow, oh my God. So I got a lot of my organizing work started, my name's Monica, doing anti-military recruitment on campus here at UIC actually, right? And so much of what you were saying was resonating with me a lot around just, so I did this organizing on campus, right? Trying to get military recruiters off campus because we were like, okay, if credit card, sharks can get banned from campus, for preying on poor Black and brown people, then military recruiters should get banned as well. And doing a lot of this work, and I was involved in the Campus Anti-War Network, and then the research of Students for a Democratic Society, but still really being in this student organizing bubble, right? And really craving how does this connect on a local level, and what can I do in my community, because I know that there's this connection with militarism and state violence, but I didn't know what it was, right? And so making that connection over time, right? So I got involved with We Charge Genocide. So We Charge Genocide was a container organization, coalition to end police violence in Chicago. One of our goals was to create a shadow report, very similar and influenced by the 1951 petition by the Civil Rights Congress. So folks like W.E.B. Du Bois, William S. Patterson, Paul Robeson, Claudia Jones, all these people got together and put together this report on the lynching of Black people by police and by vigilantes in the 50s. And they created this report and they wanted to present it to the United Nations, right? Because they wanted to bring this level of police violence to an international level, right? They wanted the whole world to know about what was happening in the US. And so they created this report, and when they tried to go deliver it, Patterson boxed up hundreds of these reports and shipped them off to Paris, because that's where the UN was at the time. Never made it there. They disappeared. His passport was seized and taken away from him by the government. Robeson tried to get a passport, and they denied him right away. All of this repression started bubbling up, right? Just because they were trying to tell the world and tell the United Nations about this violence that was happening. So in 2014, We Charge Genocide. It was a group of young Black and brown people, about 8 of us, created a We Charge Genocide report on police violence against young Black and brown people here in Chicago. It contained both youth testimonies of their interactions with police officers, and it contained data. Right, data that had been building up for years by local organizations challenging police violence and investigating police violence and harassment. And so we created this report, and this delegation of us went to the UN in Geneva, Switzerland during the Committee Against Torture. And there were other folks that were there. Folks from Ferguson were there. Mike Brown's parents were there. There was a delegation from Ferguson there as well. There was other people that were there from around the country that were challenging police violence as well, and bringing specific stories and data from their cities. And so basically what happens when you go there is everybody gets broken up into issue areas, right? And so our issue area was police violence, and we were given 2 minutes to talk to the UN to summarize all of our stories. There was 100 organizations that were there. To summarize all of our stories in 2 minutes. That's all the time you get with the UN. And so Ethan Vietz Van Leer, who's a local Chicago poet and organizer, he works with Chicago Votes now, he is a spoken word artist. And so what he did was he took everybody's stories while we were at the UN, and he created this spoken word piece. And you're supposed, usually who goes to the UN is like these advocates and like lawyers and like, and they sit there and they read the report on their piece of paper. Ethos like stood up and like, you're not supposed to stand up. And like, we held up our posters, and this is before this action. This is like day one. And like, cause there's like many days, there's like 5 days of it. And he reads this beautiful spoken word piece right next to Mike Brown's parents, and like sits down, and like we're just like, and then Brianna Champion, who's also with us, she gets to give testimony about her brother's police violence experience, and it was really powerful. And then after that, we handed our reports to the UN. And typically, what happens is you don't get mentioned in these like concluding remarks, right? You don't really get. You don't even really get your report read, right? Yet alone mentioned. And so when we're there, we're a group of like young women, gender non-conforming people, black and brown people, like all of these different sets of people that are artists and that are educators and activists and organizers. We have a lot more tools in our toolbox to try to get our message out. So what you see here is during the U.S.'s testimony, right? The U.S. talks about all the ways that the police are great in the country, and how tasers are like, they start talking about how tasers are the most non-lethal method of force against people in the U.S. But we're here saying our friend Dominique Damo Franklin, who was a young black man in Chicago who was friends with Ethos and friends with Malcolm London, who was with us, he was killed by a police officer with a taser. And so we're there being like, no, how dare you say that? And their excuse, what they're saying to say that it was non-lethal is that every police officer has a website they can read to learn how to use it. And that was it. And so we were like, that's not enough. Like, you can't just say that. So we all decided, this is totally spontaneous, we decided to stand up with these posters that say, "We charge genocide, rest in peace, Damo." And we're all standing there, and you see all the cameras like sort of turn around on us, and security's flipping out because they don't know what to do. This has never happened before. And we end up standing for 40 minutes with our arms up, because that was how long Rakia Boyd, who was a young black woman in Chicago who was shot and killed by the police officer Dante Servin, who is not a police officer anymore, but he still has his pension. She laid in the alley for 40 minutes until an ambulance came. And so her brother was there to give testimony and to find justice for his sister. And so we stood in solidarity with him for 40 minutes to honor his sister. You can go to the next one. So this is artwork that I created to sort of commemorate the 1-year anniversary of We Charge Genocide in our work. It's hanging at the DuSable Museum if you want to check it out. It's right next to like Obama becoming the first black president. So this is like a weird juxtaposition. I don't know how it ended up there. I didn't give it to them, so I don't know how it got there. So who is at the sort of forefront of these struggles, right? It's women, it's gender non-conforming people, queer and trans people, and particularly black women, who are leading a lot of these efforts against police violence in Chicago, right? Most notably Miriam Kaba. She's a prison abolitionist black woman who was in Chicago for about 20 years, recently moved to New York, but is still doing incredible work. You should follow her on Twitter. It's Prison Culture. And she was the one that sort of got us all together after Damo was killed and was like, what can we do to bring attention to this? What can we do? So like, we all got together because of her, right? Paige May, she's one of the founders of Assad's Daughter. She's a young black femme prison abolitionist who is also a huge proponent of a lot of organizing in Chicago against police and prisons. And then these photos here are during when the Muslim ban happened, when we all went out to the airport. It's me, Hoda Katabi, who is an incredible activist organizer, Layla Abdulrazak, who's another Palestinian organizer who recently moved to Detroit, and then Hannah Baptiste, who's part of Assad's Daughters. We all sort of were like, let's lead people inside and march through the airport. And so that's us sort of doing that, and we didn't know what we were doing, but we just did it, because you just got to do things, right? You can go to the next one. Yeah, and so finally being able to make these connections, right, between state violence and like between state violence and militarization. Started For the People Artists Collective. It's a radical squad of black artists and artists of color in Chicago. We make artwork for different grassroots efforts in our city with things that align with our politics. A lot of the people that were in the photo before are in the organization. And so we, do a lot of campaign work. So one was Buy Anita, which was a campaign to get State Attorney Anita Alvarez out of office. And then another one was Stop Itoa, which is from the first image on top. We were trying to make the statement that you cannot disconnect state violence and militarization. They're connected, right? They're so connected. They organize together all the time. Police are constantly getting training from learning SWAT-like tactics, and like there's a thing called the Illinois Tactical Officers Association, ITOA, ITOA. And it's basically, police getting together for a conference to learn how to do SWAT raids, to learn how to use military-like weapons. They held like workshops on like post-Ferguson policing, like things like that, right? And we're trying to be like, these things are so connected, and if they're connected and if they're organized together, then why aren't we? Why aren't we connected and doing this work together to challenge militarism and to challenge police and prisons, right? And so I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Oh, that's amazing.
That was great.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, I have so much
to say, right?
Yeah, well, you all are just saying so much good stuff. I'm like trying to write everything down and reflect on it. Hi everyone, my name is Byul. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. It's really great to be here. So I come out of also student organizing. I first got involved with activism and community organizing as a college student when I was working with campus workers to improve rights for workers on my campus, and then that led me into many years of doing campus-based work and youth organizing and anti-globalization work. And something I want to talk about is my involvement with a program called the Korean Education and Exposure Program. So this is a program that I help coordinate that I've been involved with for the past 4 years, which takes delegations of young Korean Americans to go to Korea. For many people, it's the first time they've ever been there because many of them are second gen. And so we take Korean American organizers to Korea, both North and South Korea, in order to build relationships with social justice organizers and movements that are happening over in Korea. And a lot of that work actually has to do with U.S. militarism and the impact that the U.S. military has had on the peninsula. And Korean Americans are actually in a very unique position as people who are residing here. A lot of us are citizens here. And at the same time, our family histories are so shaped by American war and what does it mean to be a Korean American when the U.S. military continues to occupy the peninsula and increase the risk of war every single day. And so I'm sorry I don't have any photos, but I am going to play a little audio recording of one of the sites that we went to this past year. But some of the business that we do are to see the impact that the U.S. military has throughout South Korea is where we're able to do that specific kind of work. So that includes going to camp towns and seeing outside of U.S. bases. I can't speak for all bases, but in Korea, outside of bases, there ends up being an entire industry that sort of emerges in order to accommodate the U.S. soldiers. And so a lot of times that's women who are getting involved with sex work. Sometimes that's trafficking involved. And so it really, really reshapes the entire community, and the entire community ends up organizing around the U.S. military presence. And so we go there to meet some of the women who are doing support work for the women who are working around camp towns, and how there's all sorts of U.S. policies in place to protect U.S. soldiers from any sort of local regulations. So there's different campaigns that pop up because women are getting hurt, and there's no accountability because they're not accountable to the local government. They're accountable to U.S. military regulations. So sites like that, and then at this past delegation, we went to visit this village in the south of the southern part of Korea called Seoseongri and Songju. So these are some villages where there's actually a new U.S. military base that's opening up. And it's supposed to be, it's called THAAD, T-H-A-A-D. You should look it up because it's an ongoing struggle. And this whole military base is supposed to be a defense system against North Korea, which I'm not going to go into my entire spiel about the Korean conflict and how lots of things are set up that it's defense, when really that's not the goal. So it's supposed to be a missile defense system in the event of a North Korean attack, except for the fact that it's so far south that it can't actually protect the majority of Koreans, because you can't intercept the missile that's already hit Seoul if you're south of it. And this entire system is actually in order to gather intelligence on China. So it's actually a surveillance system. And this surveillance system also is making this very, very quiet farming region into a target in the event of a war. And it's also just escalating tensions within the entire Asian Pacific region. And so we got to go there and actually spend time with the villagers who are resisting this base and who have been resisting it ever since they found out that it was going to happen there with absolutely no local input. And so these are farmers. The majority of them are like Haominis, which is like grandmothers. And so they've been resisting this for years. And I just want to play, because I don't have photos for y'all, I'm going to play a song. And this is a song of the grandmothers singing about their resistance to this new U.S. military base. And I can tell you a little bit. Oh, I've put it on the mic, but if you want to plug it in, we can.
No, it's not.
Okay. Yeah.
하나, 둘, 셋, 넷. 야야야, 내 나이가 어때서 청춘의 나이가 있나요? 둘, 넷. 음은 하나요. 웃긴 거 하나요. 하나님 정말 내 소원인데. 눈물이 나네요. 미국 사원다니 멍사짓기 딱 좋은 나이인데. 둘, 넷. 어나요 우연히 길 속에 비춰진 시발사고 바라오면서.
So anyways, you can hear that there's just so much joy and resilience. And the last line of that song, most of these grandmothers are like in their like 70s, 80s. Like we're talking about just like the tiniest Korean women that are like going up against the U.S. military. And the last line of that song is, "I'm the perfect age to resist. I'm the perfect age to fight." And it's originally comes from like a farming song, and then they rewrote it in order to help with their struggle. And I mean, it's just been years and years of them. They've completely reorganized their entire community to help resist this base. It's really, really incredible and very inspiring. And yeah, including like 24-hour meditation and prayer services at the base. And at this point, actually, the military has had to start flying everything in by helicopter because they've successfully blocked off all of the roads in order to be able to get in. And yeah, and I mean, this is being led by like farming grandmothers, when I heard the title of this panel, Dangerous Women, those are the women that I think of. And they're the people that no one thinks are dangerous, but actually the level of commitment and passion that they have is really what grounds me in all of the work that I do. So anyway, so this program is a really exciting program that got me to be very involved with the anti-war, anti-militarism movement and being able to understand how war and militarism has impacted my family and continues to live through my family today. And so I think that's actually a common experience among a lot of people who are living in the U.S. Have actually been displaced by U.S. wars and been displaced by U.S. militarism, either immediately within their own lives or maybe their parents or their grandparents. And so as we're seeing more and more people living here that have been displaced by U.S. wars and militarism, I think it's important for us to think about what the role is of those voices within this movement, and what the role is of organizing those diasporas, which are people who are living away from their ancestral homelands, and what is the role of those people who have a really unique position with the leverage and the voice here within the U.S., and also the connection and the community and the families who are living all over the world where U.S. military bases are. And so that's a really exciting program. And so recently, and then just I'm going to end with a bit about a new project that I'm working on. So My experience with doing youth organizing and also with this program has really got me passionate about trying to bridge between not just having us, because Koreans are working around Korean peace, and I think that's very important, and people from Iran are working on peace with Iran, and a lot of us are organizing within our own communities, and uplifting our voices is very, very important. And at the same time, I think it's limited, and I think it's really important for us to start building bridges across different communities and connecting to the different struggles that we have. And Natasha, your story about seeing it roll out in Ferguson, it's like that's exactly the kind of connection that I think is so, so important to be making right now. And connecting it with policing and prisons, and understanding that all of these struggles are so connected, and if we were all working together, what kind of power could we unleash?
WILPF. I'm sorry. I mean, we're really the organization that's completely meant for that. I mean, because it really does branch all those things. But that's just I can't help myself. Sorry.
Yeah, no.
All of those were astonishing. Thank you, all of you. I'm curious when I heard, especially Natasha and yourself, speaking about, you were talking about the camp towns and the side effects of what happens to women in the camp towns. And so militarization itself has a clear effect that hurts women in those camp towns. And then we have Natasha, who was a military woman. And I'm just curious, when you think about your life as a military woman, of course it wasn't, you weren't affected in the way these women were, but did you see that as well? Because you were talking about what you had invested your life in, coming home to your community.
Right.
She's talking about it coming home to her community, but the women in her community. And I'm wondering about that issue for you.
Yeah, it's definitely real. I remember I spent the majority of my 20 years actually overseas, stationed in several bases.
Oops, sorry.
That's okay. and I've been to the Pacific, and I know very well the stories that she's talking about. There's a very reckless rape culture in the military that is not well talked about, and it's denied, right? But you see it whether it's amongst those that should be our brothers, right, and sisters, right? Because that's just the rape culture. But then you see it and you hear about it in these overseas, or these in like Korea, where someone will automatically come home quick, and it's because they may have committed a sex crime, and instead of being held accountable, that soldier, airman, or Marine might be sent home early in lieu of local punishment. And you hear about it all the time. And so the impact of that, when I heard her say it, it was almost like I was playing the stories, because you hear about it so often. And it's not just, it's also in Japan. It's also like they have strict curfews where the military folk cannot go off base after, I want to say 9 or 10 o'clock, because it was just that rampant. And then there's places where some Marines are not allowed to go to because they're, a large, number of incidences around some of the Marine installations. So exactly what she's talking about, I also saw it in some of the bases where I was stationed, where, people are getting together for, I've told people recently that if there were a Me Too military, it would be embarrassing. I think many of you would stop thanking people for their service in a lot of ways, and it's just like one of those issues that we don't talk about enough, or going into the sexism, right, and the issues that revolve around being a woman in the military and what that is, because I don't know many women that haven't had some sort of sexual violence committed on them while in the military. I just don't know many. And then I also think it transcends to the big secret of, like, it's the deepest racism that I've ever seen. And some of the assignments that I've seen where racism and the sexism are like brother and sister in a unit. They you know, as bad as it is, where, you know, women are perhaps held in a certain regard, it's doubled down when you're a Black woman, right? So
I believe that.
Yeah.
Well, these were amazing presentations, but I thought it might be useful, and we've got some questions from the audience, but just to start things off, I wondered if we could bring it back to Jane Addams a little bit, because some of the things, you know, this close relationship between peace or anti-war, but also militarism and what that means today. Actually, there's dates back to Jane Addams, and some of the things Jane Addams was doing are extraordinary in terms of how they relate to issues of police brutality, intersectionality, which of course wasn't a term she would have used, but
Right.
so I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
As Yogi Berra said, deja vu all over again. One of the worst things that Jane Addams did, and understand in 1914, any poll, any voting about who was the greatest, most important woman in the United States, who was the most loved and respected, Jane Addams would either be 1 or 2 or 3 on that scale. She was, you know, Saint Jane. And within 1 year of The Hague, and especially as she came home, she came to the New York port, and she had a big rally at Carnegie Hall. And what she wanted to do was to report faithfully what she had seen and who she had talked to, what they had told her. And what they told her was that the French and English soldiers in the trenches had to be doped up in order for them to fight, because they had to be pushed into it. And what she was doing was she was taking the veil off of the so-called war virtues. She was showing that war is not noble, that there's nothing good about it, that we have to find another way to solve conflict. Well, this was getting at patriarchy in, you know, I want to say in the balls. Yes, I'll say it. Right there. And it was hurting. They were hurt. And this journalist, Richard Davis, who was a jingoistic yellow journalist who had worked for William Randolph Hearst. He had been the one that had basically made the image of the Rough Rider. And, you know, so many of our wars were over things that never happened, that were staged and so forth, but this masculinity, and he basically said that he began the campaign against Jane Addams. It was in the New York Times. By the time she came to Chicago, there was a rally of her supporters in Chicago, 3,000 strong at the Auditorium Theater, to buoy her up. But she became an object of surveillance by the FBI. She was surveilled for the rest of her life. She worried that she would not be able to get a passport. And all kinds of things happened. The DAR, she was a member of the DAR, not that she wanted to be, but she was Daughters of the American Revolution. They threw her out, and so forth. She, by saying honest things about what happens in soldiering, that is a dangerous thing in a society which has to prop up a military and achieve that. The other thing she did was in 1920, when there were 4,000 deportations in Chicago, when because of the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the fear of Bolshevism and so forth, people were being deported simply because they were a political party that the government wanted to get rid of. Addams, at the same time, the 1919 race riot in the city of Chicago had been, the culmination of hundreds of lynchings and race riots, including one in 1909 in Springfield, Illinois, at the time when they were getting ready for the centennial of Lincoln's birth. And that was one of the things that started the NAACP. And Addams is being attacked by the American Legion, by the newspapers and so forth, and she says, why are you attacking me? Why aren't you arresting the people who are bombing the homes of black people in Chicago who are trying to get better homes and better neighborhoods, and the white people who are willing to rent to them? Why are they not being bombed? Why are they not being charged and investigated? And what she saw was a militarization of the police, and this was in 1920, and she'd even written about it in 1907, was the fact that the police were there not to protect and serve the community, but to protect property and to protect the interests of the ruling elite.
Yes.
And so the militarism of the police was a long-standing situation. And so so in writing against these things, she saw immediately she saw these connections. And this is what was making her dangerous. Just being for peace did not make her dangerous. It was the intersection of peace with these justice movements, and naming was making her dangerous.
Well, I have a question from the floor. How does the social justice efforts dating back to Jane Addams coalesce with climate/environmental justice on a global scale? Anybody want to tackle that?
Well, I'll say it this way, and I think we've got climate change is a clear and present danger. I think when we talk about what's happening in terms of refugees and the diaspora, it is not merely the wars, it is also climate. And we have to recognize that that is a big piece of what's driving a lot of refugees cross-continent now. So when we're talking justice and social justice, we cannot cease to also speak about climate change and sustainability. They're absolutely interconnected. And I will also say that WILPF, I just can't help myself, has been talking about things like water and the privatization of water, which is another climate issue, right?
Yes.
For 30, 40 years, right? This question of privatization of water. So what I'd say is Jane Addams, again, the thing that she had that you, Rima, just really sort of showed just a moment ago is she had vision. Like, she didn't just see, here is this thing happening right now in Chicago, right? She could put it into a larger context.
Yes.
And the important thing that she gave us is that analytic skill, right? I mean, that's one of the important things she gave us, is this analytic skill to take what we're seeing and understand the larger factors pushing some of those things. Does that answer the question?
I think it does.
Okay, thank you. All right.
A very long question here. While I'm reading this long question to myself first, so I understand it, make sure I can read the writing. One thing I was really interested in hearing from the panelists is sort of unpacking the language that we've been using. I'm thinking of generational differences in the way we use words like peace, the connotations of that, particularly the association of that with womanhood or femininity, and the problems with that. The term militarism and how that's changed and how it's used. So I wonder if any of you want to talk about just the language that we're using then and now, and how it's maybe evolved, or particularly I'm thinking in terms of gender is very interesting.
Well, you know, there's that saying about peace, like there's so often peace seems just quietness or quiet, but peace is, what do we say? It's not the absence of war, it's the presence of justice.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I think that kind of sums up how I feel about peace. And what it also requires is endless effort, which, you know, that's also not very peaceful, or at least what I used to think of as peace. I used to think peace was a quiet little space that I could go off to. I don't think that anymore. I read something by a young man whose name I'm going to forget, who is dying of ALS, who's been an activist for quite a long time, and he had a piece in, was it The Atlantic, I believe, 3 or 4 weeks ago, and he talked about hope. And I loved this. I'm sorry, this is a little off topic, but he talked about hope, and he said, hope is not something that we go to when we're feeling despair so that we have a panacea. Hope is a battering ram, and it makes us work. And I thought, yeah, that's about how I feel about peace. Peace and hope are not passive. That's the point. They're not passive. They are active measures. Not the same active measures as others, but that's how I like to think about those ideas. That's me. But anybody else on those?
I think that really represents the way in which earlier maternalist expressions had been turned on their head by the Congress of Women at The Hague and the kind of activism and advocacy that Addams championed. And it's interesting because while she was vilified, while she was surveilled, the structures that she had created organizationally still made her a person that presidents needed to speak to. So at the same time that she was that the Chicago Tribune, which was in this period a very reactionary newspaper, I don't know how much it's changed, but anyway, it was very, at this period, around World War I, we're attacking her almost daily. She was visiting President Wilson and had a very important role in, unfortunately, unsuccessfully campaigning for the acceptance of the League of Nations, which never occurs in the United States. We don't accept it. The world accepts it. We don't. Addams was, when I said that she wanted to put flesh and bones into this concept of peace, she had started this with labor conflict. She had a very amazing intellectual understanding of, at that time, the current conceptions of evolutionary theory, anthropology. She was one of the earliest disciples of a sociologist by the name of Patrick Giddings. Giddis in Scotland. She was a reader of Charles Darwin and Herbert Spencer. She was looking for patterns in world history, and she came upon the concept that the nurturing instincts, which she didn't think were necessarily biological, they were the construction of the need for the human race to survive. And she believed that these had developed far earlier than the military instincts, which eclipsed these nurturing. And she saw nurturing as a societal need, responsibility, not just of women, but of women and men. And that what she looked to was in the industrial world, which was more interdependent and had created new needs and responsibilities. She understood that there was this global situation of migrations, of economy, and she really saw this positive understanding of peace related to this evolutionary social progress. And unfortunately, in 1907, when she really, in this Newer Ideals of Peace, which really lays it out, she is looking at the withering away, for example, of the military virtues. Ultimately, by 1935, she understood that it was going to take a much longer time than anything that she had imagined, and in some ways I think it was fortunate that she didn't have to know what Hitler was about to do. But so there are many things that are weak in her understanding. I think I've discussed how she was overly optimistic, but she really believed that we were, not because of that human nature in its relationship to the evolutionary progress and the cultural progress of the human race, which she considered one universal race. She did not see that there were races of people. And in that we were going toward this acceptance of the abolition of violence in conflict. And what she said was, look, we used to have slavery, we don't have slavery. We used to have blood libel, we don't have blood libel. The human race is growing out of its militarism. She also realized that all of us had to help it along.
I wanted to start thinking of closing this with some thoughts about the future and how hopeful you are about youth movements in general, about women's movements, and about how to activate energy going forward. Does anybody want to?
Yeah, so I'm actually working with a group of organizers based here in Chicago to try to address that exact question, to try to launch a sort of a youth movement around anti-militarism and bring our generation up to speed about all of these conversations, because I think that it's been lost among young folks, and I think that Natasha was talking about how the military isn't really seen as a very political thing for young people, and that's very, very intentional, right? That's because of the recruitment machine, and they learned a lot during Vietnam War protests and how to, withhold information from everyday people so that people don't really know what's going on with the military. And so I think it's very, very important, especially right now while the country is so polarized and while people are kind of reorganizing their political identity and understanding what does it mean to be an American when this is what our country looks like right now. I think that as we're more and more polarized, it's important that the conversation of militarism is brought into it and that people really integrate that into their own political identity, and understanding that if I am for women, if I am for people of color, if I am for queer people, then that means that I must be anti-military. And I think that's a jump that we have a lot of work to help people make. And so something that we're working on is trying to design a new organization that will take responsibility to organize young people and make sure that it's being led by those who are most impacted by war. So that's the people who are getting recruited, and that's the people who are being displaced by militarism and war. And so I think that if we're going to reignite a strong anti-militarism movement, that the most important way that is going to happen is for it to be led by and for people who are most impacted. And so that's something that we're working on right now, and it's a little bit too early to tell you too much about it, but that's the hope, is that we're going to work on this, and that we have to take responsibility as people living here within the US and with the access that we do have, because people all over the world are organizing and dedicating their entire lives and putting their lives and bodies on the line to resist the US military machine, and it's important that us as people living here are working in solidarity and supporting their work. So I'm very hopeful. Yeah.
Monica, are you hopeful too?
I'm hopeful. I was just thinking about so the budget just passed for policing for 2019, and it's gone from, we actually spend $4 million a day on policing in Chicago, and now it's going up to $4.5 million a day. So I was just thinking, I don't know why I was thinking about that, but I was thinking about that, and oh, that's why I was, that's the hopeful thing. But yeah, so the one thing that I'm currently working on that's being led by mostly women and gender nonconforming people is a campaign called No Cop Academy. And so we're working with about 80 different organizations across Chicago, including War Resisters League, which is a national organization challenging militarization across the U.S. and the whole world. And so one of the things we're doing, we're doing a lot of things, but the main piece of the campaign is stopping the construction of a $95 million police academy in West Garfield Park. Something that I forgot to say at the end of my spiel about We Charge Genocide is that we were named, Chicago was named as a site of intense police violence in the UN's closing recommendations, which was partially why the DOJ came to Chicago to investigate the Chicago Police Department. And they made 99 recommendations for police reform, and one of them was that the training center that they currently have is outdated. But there was 98 other ones about how they could improve right now, right? And so Rahm Emanuel decided to focus, number one, on the $95 million building a new police academy for Chicago police, which is actually going to cost way more than that. And he's saying that the DOJ, that he's doing it because that's what the DOJ said, but when we filed FOIAs, which are Freedom of Information Acts, we found out that he was talking about it 4 months before the DOJ report even came out. So there's plenty of lies that are, that we're uncovering slowly. But so that's an effort. You can find out about it at nocopacademy.com, or you can follow us on Twitter or on Facebook at No Cop Academy.
Yeah, I'm hopeful. When I look at, speaking of like CPD's budget, when I look at the defense spending in 2017, it was $668 billion. And then also knowing that only $190 billion were committed to anti-poverty programs. Like, let's just pause right there. Like, that ain't right. So when I think about peace, I think about reimagining what $668 billion can do. I'll tell you, the Chicago that I came back home to in 2016 is not the Chicago that I left in '97. And for me, it was like reacclimating to, like, I don't know. I can't even really put a word on it other than like devastation, right? When I go down the block that I grew up on 65th and Winchester, and a lot of the homes are just gone, right? So the dollar lot program means something different to me, like those lots where, where my friends lived. So when we talk about like defense spending and how that is, and if you don't look at it as that is an extraction of funds from communities that need it. Exactly. And we have to be clear about that. So it is not about your son or daughter who is in the military getting extra pay. It's not about that, because actually we know that they don't make enough, and the majority of military children qualify for free lunch. Free lunch, not reduced, free lunch. So we know that this is about the gross misspending of federal contractors and wars. When you talked about the buildup, and I know the units that are getting prepared for that buildup, and when you know about just the waste that is like ignored for the sake of just get it done, right? And so when I think about like all of the funding that's wasted on militarism, and I think about how we can start reimagining that, for me locally it starts in CPS. It's saying that $18 million can give schools or remove lead from schools that need it. It's actually in putting programs in schools so that these kids don't have to choose the military enlistment in 2020. And so I'm hopeful, to how to get engaged. Veterans for Peace, we're having a hard time getting CPS to want to invite us into the schools to talk about this. Let's just be clear. So if it's not like, some of the social justice or woke teachers who will invite us into their classrooms, they don't want these young folks to hear some of this truth. And so if you know organizations, if you have community meetings, you know, we can make ourselves available. We have a speakers bureau that will come out and talk about this. And not all of it is bad. It depends. Like one-on-one, if you know a young person that wants to join a branch of military, reach out to us, and we'll connect with that young person so that you have with the family, so that they have a better understanding. And we would prefer if young folks would, you know, choose the Peace Corps and other, you know, ways to serve.
Well, I think we've answered the one final question from the floor, which was, what should we do to promote Jane Addams? I think you've all done that beautifully today, and have suggested many ways we can continue to promote her message and her work during World War I. So thank you all so much.